Alrighty, welcome back to my channel. You can see I'm in a different location today. It is really, really cold. So instead of sitting on my porch and trying to bundle up in jackets and boots and all that nonsense, I came up to my kid's room. So I'm in my son's room. I've recorded from here before, but it's been about a year since I've been up here. But today I wanted to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche's Human All Too Human. So this is a philosophy text, and I'll read the back cover of this and I'll give an overview of the book, the way that it's broken up, and then hit on some of the key ideas here. Now, I'm not like a real big philosophy guy, but I'll do my best to talk about this book and the things that I found interesting in it. So here we go. Written after Nietzsche had ended his friendship with Richard Wagner and had been forced to leave academic life through ill health, Human All Too Human, published in 1878, can be read as a monument to his personal crisis. It also marks the point when he matured as a philosopher, rejecting German Romanticism, espoused by Wagner and Schopenhauer, and instead returned to sources in the French Enlightenment. So he actually praises Voltaire in this book. Here he sets out his unsettling views in a series of 638 stunning aphorisms. So the book is divided into, like I said, 300 or 638 aphorisms. So as you can see, some of them are rather short, just a couple of lines. Some of them are like a paragraph, all right, in length. They're all, kind of pithy. That's one of the things I'll talk about here. It's the way this is laid out. And then it says, let's see, assessing subjects ranging from art to arrogance, boredom to passion, science to vanity, women to youth. The work also contains the seeds of concepts crucial to Nietzsche's later philosophy, such as the will to power. And you really don't see will to power show up in this book, but like the seeds of it are there. And let's see. Will to power and the need to transcend conventional Christian morality. So, in other words, to go beyond good and evil, right? Which is one of the titles of one of his works. So, also the genesis of those ideas are here. The result is one of the cornerstones of his life's work. This is the Marion Faber and Stephen Lehman translation. It says that it remains faithful to the tone and meaning of the original. There's an introduction in this book by Marion Faber discussing Nietzsche's evolving philosophy, the aphorism form, and the structure of the work. So, this is the first work that Nietzsche uses the aphorism, okay? And it comes from like the French tradition in philosophy. It's not really a systematic work. It's not laid out systematically. The book is divided into 9 parts or 9 chapters, and I've written down like a summary of each, okay? And I will be referring to my notes here heavily, and I'll read, I'll give an overview of each of these sections, and I'll hit on the things that I found interesting. So, section 1 is of the first and last things. Okay, so foundational principles that Nietzsche is going to hit on. Here in this chapter, he discusses the origin of metaphysics and critiques it. And ultimately, he ends up rejecting metaphysics. So what metaphysics are is if you think about the nature of reality and everything, if you've read anything about Plato, Aristotle, the realm of the forms, okay, where we use like natural theology, where we look at the natural world around us and then we reason back to the good, okay, like these Socratic philosophers did and whatnot. Basically, you're talking about like the realm of the forms. Think of like Plato's allegory of the cave, that type of stuff. All right, and this is like pretty much hard baked into like Western metaphysics or the Western philosophical tradition. And he ultimately rejects all of that. So he's really agnostic on metaphysics. He says if metaphysics do exist, there's really not anything that we can concretely know about them. So ultimately, they're kind of useless for us. So we're just going to reject them and throw them away. So it's kind of like his conclusion. There's a lot of things in here that I think are interesting. I think probably chapter 1 of this book was probably the most interesting chapter, just to see what his foundational principles are. And he does bring up the concept of the free spirit, and we'll get into the free spirit later on. That's going to pop up later on. But I think that the most interesting part for us here would be number 2, what he calls the congenital defect of philosophers. And he says here, quote, all philosophers suffer from the same defect in that they start with present day man and think they can arrive at their goal by analyzing him. Instinctively, they let man hover before them as an eternal truth, something unchanging in all turmoil, a secure measure of things. But everything the philosopher asserts about man is basically no more than a statement about man within a very limited time span. A lack of historical sense is the congenital defect of all philosophers. Some unwittingly even take the most recent form of man as it developed under the imprint of certain religions or even certain political events as the fixed form from which one must proceed. They do not understand that man is evolved, that the faculty of knowledge has also evolved, while some of them even permit themselves to spin the whole world from out of this faculty of knowledge. And I'm not going to go any farther than that, but he is right. Like the lack of we're looking at present day man and trying to use him as our starting point, okay? And that's not really good. For a Christian, like reading this, like I agree with Nietzsche here. I'm surprised. There's actually points of agreement when I read Nietzsche, and I said, yes, I agree with him, because for a Christian, now he would reject this ultimately. Nietzsche would not agree with this. But we would look to man prior to what's called the fall of man, as man's original state. And of course, ultimately Nietzsche would reject that idea. But, I would say, yeah, foundationally, I agree. You can't look at man and start with him as he currently is in a modern sense to form your ideals. You have to have a historical worldview. He says a lot of these metaphysics, they come from the realm of fear, people being afraid of the chaos of the world that they're living in, and then from phenomena such as dreams. People have dreams. This is how they came up with metaphysics. Like I said, he ultimately rejects all of that. So section 2, on the history of moral feelings. In this section of the book, he discusses the history of morality, and he critiques the origins of the concepts of good and evil, and ultimately attributes morality to being part of a custom or a tradition. And here I have highlighted aphorism 97 because I thought that was important. So here he says, quote, an important type of pleasure and thus an important source of morality grows out of habit. One does habitual things more easily, skillfully, gladly. One feels a pleasure at them, knowing from experience that the habit has stood the test and is useful. A morality one can live with has been proved salutary, effective in contrast to all as yet unproven new experiments. Accordingly, custom is the union of the pleasant and the useful. In addition, it requires no thought. As soon as man can exercise force, he exercises it to introduce and enforce his mores. To him, they represent proven wisdom. Likewise, a community will force each individual in it to the same mores. Here is the error. Because one feels good with one custom, or at least because he lives his life by means of it, the custom is necessary, for he holds it to be the only possibility by which one can feel good. The enjoyment of life seems to grow out of it alone. This idea of habit as a condition of existence is carried right into the smallest details of custom, since lower peoples and cultures have only very slight insight into the real causality. They make sure with superstitious fear. So here he is taking a critique at, like perhaps like divine command theory, right? Like that these traditions supposedly, in his view, came from God or the gods. So fear of divine retribution would be one of the things that he's taking a shot at. He says that everything takes the same course, even where a custom is difficult, harsh, or burdensome. It is preserved because it seems to be highly useful. They do not know that the same degree of comfort can also exist with other customs, that even higher degrees of comfort can be attained, but they do perceive that all customs, even the harshest, become more pleasant and mild with time, and that even the severest way of life can become a habit and thus a pleasure. So here's part of, and I didn't highlight everything here, but I thought that one was kind of important to his idea of the history of moral feelings, is that ultimately, like I said, he boils it down to custom and tradition. And essentially, it's like these things become ingrained, and we do this because that's the way it's always been done. And he wants to break those things and kind of tear down the superstructure of not just religious life, but also of the state. So he's going to attack both religion and the state in this work. Okay, so section 3, moving on. He is going to say that this is an examine of religious worship and tradition within a psychological framework. So he's looking at religion and worship of a deity or deities within a psychological frame. And he's going to start to critique Christianity pretty heavily here. And starting in, let's see, aphorism 113, he says, Christianity as antiquity. When we hear the old bells ringing out on a Sunday morning, we ask ourselves, can it be possible this is for a Jew crucified 2,000 years ago who said he was the Son of God? The proof for such a claim is wanting. Within our times, the Christian religion is surely an antiquity jutting out from a far distant olden time, and the fact that people believe such a claim, while they are otherwise so strict in testing assertions, is perhaps the oldest part of this heritage. A God who conceives children with a mortal woman, a wise man who calls upon us to work no more, to judge no more, but to heed the signs of the imminent apocalypse, a justice that accepts the innocent man as a proxy sacrifice, someone who has his disciples drink his blood, prayers for miraculous interventions, sins against a God atoned for by a God, fear of the afterlife to which death is the gate, the figure of the cross is a symbol, and a time that no longer knows the purpose and shame of the cross. How horridly all this wafts over us, as from the grave of an ancient past. Are we to believe that such things are still believed? So as you can see, he's taking shots at the church. And I'm going to skip on to 116, aphorism 116. He says, the everyday Christian, if Christianity were right in its tenets of a vengeful God, general sinfulness, predestination, and the danger of eternal damnation, it would be a sign of stupidity and lack of character not to become a priest, apostle, or hermit, and with fear and trembling work exclusively on one's own salvation. It would be nonsensical to lose sight of one's eternal advantage for temporary comfort. Assuming that he believes at all, the everyday Christian is a pitiful figure, a man who really cannot count up to 3, and who, besides, precisely because of his mental incompetence, would not deserve such a punishment as Christianity promises him. So you can see he's really taking a shot at the intellect of people that believe in Christianity. And one of the things that Nietzsche is going to hammer on over and over again throughout the course of all 9 sections of this book is the statement that there are no absolute truths. So in Nietzsche's worldview, like, everything is relative. All truths are relative. Okay? There is no absolute truth. One of the things I will critique about the statement that there are no absolute truths is that the statement itself, there are no absolute truths, is a statement of absolution, meaning that to say there are no absolute truths is in itself an absolute truth. So, I mean, it's kind of, that's kind of low hanging fruit there for me to pick on, but it is a thing. And then there's this other thing where Nietzsche has reject metaphysics, but yet he believes, or at least he holds to in this book, that the human will is bound, that man doesn't have a free will, which I'm assuming probably comes from his upbringing, because Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran minister who died when he was very young. But Lutheranism teaches the bondage of the will. In fact, it's one of the books written by Luther. It's titled The Bondage of the Will. So I would ask, like, Nietzsche, like, what is the will? What is it? He doesn't really get into will to power in this book, but the human will is not, where does it come from? It's clearly like a metaphysical concept. And I think he tried to tie it down to psychology and human, I don't know, chemicals in your body and neurons firing in your brain. But the thing is that he's not a materialist. So it's very bizarre, because one of the things that he critiques in this book is he critiques Darwinism. He really comes after Charles Darwin. And so Nietzsche's kind of a difficult figure to pin down. Now, as I said, this is a transitory text. This isn't really his ideas really fleshed out. They're all kind of here in embryonic form. This is the first thing that he wrote, once he broke free as a philosopher on his own, when he had broken away from Richard Wagner. So, yeah, it's kind of, things aren't fully like brought to their complete and fullest form. So let me read a little bit more here. Aphorism, let's see, 117. He says, on the shrewdness of Christianity, it is a trick of Christianity to teach the utter worthlessness, sinfulness, and despicableness of man in general so loudly that disdain for one's fellow man becomes impossible. Let him sin as he will, he is essentially no different from me. I am the one who is in all ways unworthy and despicable, the Christian tells himself. But this feeling too has lost its sharpest sting, because the Christian does not believe in his individual despicableness. He is wicked simply because he is a man, and calms himself a bit with the tenet, we are all of one kind. So, again, I would say that Nietzsche is kind of right, and I kind of agree with him in this presentation of Christianity, because this is clearly like he's taking a shot at Western Christianity, which became very pessimistic, anthropologically, its view of man, following the schism between the East and the West, whereas the Eastern Church tends to view the church and Christ as a healer who comes to heal sickness and disease, kind of like a divine physician. The West kind of focuses more on it as a penalty or something defective in man that needs to be punished. So it's therapeutic method of salvation, the Eastern model, which kind of treats the church more like a hospital, versus the Western conception of Christianity, which tends to treat man as a guilty criminal who is in need of divine wrath and punishment. So I think if that's the worldview that you're coming from and the way that you're viewing Christianity, then, like this anthropological pessimism that he's talking about here, he's clearly critiquing the Western church. And I would kind of agree with him on that. Okay, so let's see, 119. The fate of Christianity. Christianity came into existence in order to lighten the heart, but now it has to burden the heart first in order to be able to lighten it afterward. Consequently, it will perish. So here we go. He's basically taking a shot at the Western Church, saying that its goal there is to lighten the heart, but it has to first make man feel miserable and vile and disgusting, and worthy of punishment, so that it can assuage his fears and calm him and soothe him. And I would say again, yes, this is clearly like the Western Church. When you start having things like Anselm of Canterbury developing his satisfaction theory of atonement, of course, we get into like the Middle Ages with the whole Catholic penitential system, and then this is what causes the Reformation, is all this weird stuff that gets tacked on, people flailing themselves and fanaticism, and I mean even Dostoevsky would agree with Nietzsche on this. Fyodor Dostoevsky would agree with Nietzsche on his criticism here. And he says, consequently, it will perish. Well, yes, I believe that the Western Church is an atheist factory. Okay? So I agree with Nietzsche. And I think that Dostoevsky's view in the book, The Idiot, that I just read, that was his critique when he was coming after the Pope. So I think Dostoevsky and Nietzsche would agree, at least on the Western Church. But I think that Nietzsche is going to go beyond that, because really what he's seeking to do here is to, in the next chapter, we're going to move on. So section 4, from the soul of artists and workers. And here he's going to take a shot at divine inspiration of art. He's going to criticize it. Really what he's doing is coming after Richard Wagner, his former friend, but he never names him by name. He just simply refers to him as the artist. And he's really intent or focused in this section of the book and the previous section on religious life of tearing down traditional beliefs and questioning their entire value structure. So once he's done that, he moves on to section 5, which here is signs of higher and lower culture. And this is the section of the book where he's going to critique Darwinism and come after like Charles Darwin and kind of reject it. And here in this section, he also, in this dismantling process, he's now offering up his solution to it, which is the idea of the free spirit. So this book is for free spirits, and the free spirit is going to become a major theme in Nietzsche's work. And here I've written down aphorism 225, and I will read, we'll read that. So here we go. The free spirit, a relative concept. A man is called a free spirit if he thinks otherwise than would be expected, based on his origin, environment, class, and position, or based on prevailing contemporary views. He is the exception. Bound spirits are the rule. These are people that are bound by custom and tradition, are bound spirits, and people that are free from it, are free spirits. So the latter reproach him that his free principles have their origin either in a need to be noticed, or else may even lead to one to suspect him of his free actions. That is, actions that are irreconcilable with bound morality. Sometimes it is also said that certain free principles derive from perverseness and eccentricity, but this is only the voice of malice, which does not itself believe what it says, but only wants to hurt. For the free spirit generally has proof of his greater kindness and sharp intellect written so legibly on the face that bound spirits understand it well enough, but the two other derivations of free thinking are meant honestly, and many free spirits do indeed come into being in one or the other of these ways. But the tenets they arrive at thereby could still be more true and reliable than the tenets of bound spirits. In the knowledge of the truth, what matters is having it, not what made one seek it or how one found it. Now this is interesting. Knowledge of the truth, when he's already stated there are no absolute truths. So this is one of the things Nietzsche, what is knowledge of the truth? if all truth is relative and there are no absolutes, then all you really have is personal truth. And I don't know. This is one of the things that, like, it's a bit like kind of trying to hammer down Jello, or nail Jello to the wall. If you have like this view of truth that's always in a state of flux and it's not static. So yeah, what matters is having it, not what made one seek it or how one found it. If the free spirits are right, the bound spirits are wrong. Whether or not the former came to truth out of immorality and the others have kept clinging to the untruth out of morality, incidentally, it is not part of the nature of the free spirit that his views are more correct, but rather that he has released himself from tradition. That's important. This is his definition. I'm going to say that again. Incidentally, it is not part of the nature of the free spirit that his views are more correct, but rather that he has released himself from tradition, be it successfully or unsuccessfully. However, usually, however, he has truth, or at least the spirit of the search for truth on his side. He demands reasons, while others demand faith. And in aphorism 226, he's again going to take a shot at Christianity. And people that are of the Christian faith are bound spirits. Okay? They are bound to a tradition that he says is, he wants to attack that and tear it down. Let's see. So we'll move on from this. So basically, what is the key here is this is one of the reasons why Nietzsche is called like the father of existentialism, because essentially, if you've torn down the power structures and you no longer have like a truth code given to you from a higher moral, from God, like divine command, from the church, then you have to provide a truth for yourself. You have to define your own joy or happiness, right? Like you have to make your own set of truths and values. So he's an existentialist. Part number 6 is man in society. And here he's going to talk about the customs and manners in society. I'm going to kind of just skip over that. Section 7 is woman and child. These are psychological observations that he makes on women and children and marriage. And in aphorism 426, he's ultimately going to say that marriage is not compatible with free spirits. So it's a rejection of marriage, or traditional marriage as we would see it. Here he says here, free spirits and marriage. Will free spirits live with women? In general, I believe that as truth-speaking men of the present, they must, like the prophetic birds of ancient times, prefer to fly alone. So, yeah, he's really critical of marriage as an institution, and essentially wants to see it go the way of the dodo. Section number 8, a look at the state. Now, this is an analysis of power structures in society. And in this section of the book, he critiques socialism. Pretty strong critique of socialism and what you would call social justice. So he would have like no time for social justice warriors today. Here we see, we'll read this section, or aphorism 452, possession and justice. When socialists prove that the distribution of wealth in present-day society is the consequence of countless injustices and atrocity, rejecting in summa the obligation towards anything so unjustly established, they are seeing one particular thing only. The whole past of the old culture is built on violence, slavery, deception, error. But we, the heirs of these conditions, indeed the convergence of the whole past, cannot decree ourselves away and cannot want to remove one particular part. The unjust frame of mind lies in the souls of the have-nots. 2. they are no better than the haves, and have no special moral privilege. For at some point their forefathers were haves too. We do not need forcible new distribution of property, but rather gradual transformation of attitude. Justice must become greater in everyone, and the violent instinct weaker. So, and there's plenty more of this, but you would think, well, maybe he's like a nationalist, but no, he critiques nationalism as well, and this is going to put him at odds with the German romanticist. So like it's well known that Richard Wagner was like strong into nationalism, and actually Richard Wagner was anti-Semitic as well, and Nietzsche actually speaks out in one section of this against anti-Semitism. So yeah, it's interesting. So you can't peg Nietzsche as an anti-Semite because he's not one. He actually says that the Jewish people are no different than any of us. Okay, we're all basically the same. And I didn't write that section down, but he's not into nationalism. In fact, here, the European man and the destruction of nations. Commerce and industry, traffic in books and letters. This is aphorism 475. The commonality of all higher culture, quick change of locality and landscape, that present-day nomadic life of all non-landowners. These conditions necessarily bring about a weakening and ultimately a destruction of nations. I agree with them on this. Okay, this is the state that we're in now in the modern age. The weakening of nations comes about because of this people not owning land. It says these conditions necessarily bring about a weakening and ultimately a destruction of nations, or at least of European nations, so that a mixed race, that of the old European man, has to originate out of all of them as the result of continual crossbreeding. The isolation of nations due to engendered national hostilities now works against this goal, consciously or unconsciously, but the mixing process goes on slowly. Nevertheless, despite those intermittent countercurrents, this artificial nationalism, by the way, is as dangerous as artificial Catholicism was, for it is in essence a forcible state of emergency and martial law imposed by the few on the many and requiring cunning lies and force to remain respectable. It is not the self-interest of the many, the people, as one would have it, that urges this nationalism, but primarily the self-interest of certain royal dynasties, as well as that of certain commercial and social classes. And once a man has understood this, he should be undaunted and presenting himself as a good European, and should work actively on merging of nations. The Germans, because of their age-old proven trait of being the nation's interpreter and mediator, will be able to help in this process. So he's basically advocating for globalism, the non-existent of nation states. So he's not a socialist. He's also not a nationalist. And here in this section, 475, this is where he talks about the Jewish people. Incidentally, the whole problem of the Jews exists only within national states, and as much as their energy and higher intelligence, their capital of spirit and will, which accumulated from generation to generation in the long school of their suffering, must predominate to a degree that awakens envy and hatred. And so in the literature of nearly all present-day nations, and in fact in proportion to their renewed nationalistic behavior, there is an increase in the literary misconduct that leads the Jews to the slaughterhouse as scapegoats for every possible public and private misfortune. As soon as it's no longer a matter of preserving nations, but rather producing the strongest possible mixed European race, the Jew becomes as useful and desirable as an ingredient as any other national quantity. Every nation, every man has disagreeable, even dangerous characteristics. It is cruel to demand that the Jew should be an exception. Those characteristics may even be especially dangerous and frightful in him, and perhaps the youthful Jew of the stock exchange is the most repugnant invention of the whole human race. So people would say, well, that's anti-Semitic. But actually, if you read the statement prior to that, he's basically saying every race on the earth has its, its things that are bad. Like they each have ingrained in them a culture that is negative. And that they're actually, to target them out or single them out alone is wrong, right? He says, nevertheless, I would like to know how much one excuse in the overall accounting of a people which, not without guilt on our parts, has been the most sorrowful history of all people, and to whom we owe the noblest human being, Christ. So he actually calls Jesus here the noblest human being, but he's looking at Christ as purely a man and not the God-man. So to him, because he doesn't believe in the divine, okay, he's rejected divinity, Christ is just a man to Nietzsche. And he says, and they've also given us the purest philosopher, Spinoza, the mightiest book, so he's referring there to the Bible, all right, and the most effective moral code in the world, which I'm assuming he's referring to the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments. Furthermore, in the darkest medieval times, when the Asiatic cloud had settled heavily on Europe, it was the Jewish freethinkers, scholars, and doctors who, under the harshest personal pressure, held fast to the banner of the Enlightenment and intellectual independence and defended Europe against Asia. We owe to their efforts not least that a moral, natural, rational, and in any event unmythical explanation of the world could finally triumph again. And the ring of culture which now links us to the Enlightenment of Greco-Roman antiquity remained unbroken. If Christianity did everything possible to orientalize the Occident, then Judaism helped substantially to Occidentalize it again and again, which in certain senses to say it made Europe's history and task into a continuation of the Greek. So, as you can see here, he actually has more respect for Judaism than he does for Christianity. Go figure. All right. I'm going to move on from here. So the final summation here is that Nietzsche tends to gravitate more towards being an anarchist, okay? And that he rejects basically nation states and governmental power structures. And then section 9 in the book is the final section, and it's man alone with himself. And aphorism 638, which ends the book. I'm not going to go through all this, but there's a lot. This book has got a lot. I'm just hitting on some of the key points. He comes up here and he mentions the wanderer as a figure in the final aphorism in the book. The wanderer is going to be a figure that's going to pop up again in Nietzsche's other writings. So here we have this. He says, the wanderer. He who has come only in part to a freedom of reason cannot feel on earth otherwise than as a wanderer, though not as a traveler towards a final goal, for this does not exist. So for Nietzsche, there is no telos. There is no final destination to be reached because the truth is forever changing, which really makes the search for truth kind of the whole thing. Whereas if you can never find the truth, and even if you found the truth is ever changing. You're just in this continual state of wandering, always journeying but never finding. Yeah. So I don't know how that could be ultimately fulfilling for a person. I mean, Jesus said in the Bible that the truth shall set you free. But if you can't find the truth is always beyond you, then how could you ever be free? I mean, essentially you become bound. But again, that's me critiquing Nietzsche from my worldview. So let's see. So the traveling towards the final goal, the goal does not exist. But he does want to observe and keep his eyes open for everything that actually occurs in the world. Therefore, he must not attach his heart too firmly to any individual thing. There must be something wandering within him, which takes its joy in change and transitoriness. Is that a word? Did I say that right? To be sure, such a man will have bad nights when he is tired and finds closed the gates to the city that should offer him rest. Perhaps in addition, as in the Orient, in the East, the desert reaches up to the gate. Predatory animals howl now near, now far. A strong wind stirs. Robbers lead off his pack animals. Then for him the frightful night sinks over the desert like a second desert, and his heart becomes tired of wandering. If the morning sun then rises, glowing like a divinity of wrath, and the city opens up, he sees in the faces of its inhabitants perhaps more of desert, dirt, deception, uncertainty than outside the gates, and the day is almost worse than the night. So it may happen sometime to the wanderer, but then, as a recompense, comes the ecstatic morning of other regions and days. Then, nearby, in the dawning light, he has already seized the bands of muses dancing past him in the midst of the mountains. Afterwards, he strolls quietly, in the equilibrium of his forenoon soul, under trees from whose tops leafy corners only good and bright things are thrown down to him, the gifts of all those free spirits who are at home in the mountain, wood, and solitude, and who are like him in their sometimes merry, sometimes contemplative way, wanderers and philosophers, born out of the mysteries of the dawn. They ponder how the day can have such a pure, transparent, transfigured, and cheerful face between the hours of 10 and 12. They seek the philosophy of the forenoon. And then he ends with a kind of like a poem about friends. And that concludes the book. So he doesn't really have his philosophy worked out here. It's all kind of like in an embryonic form. I think the big takeaways from this are, number one, the denial of absolute truth. There is no absolute truth. Number two, his denial of free will. There is no free will. Everybody's bound. So I don't know how you can reject metaphysics and then have this reality of the will. He doesn't have will to power worked out here yet. That's kind of in embryonic form. But the will, how do you explain the will without metaphysics? I don't know. And then I think so, yeah, those things. And then he works out this idea of always wandering. And then the absolute critique of government, marriage, power structures within like church and religion. So it's basically just laying waste to everything. And then you adopt this existential ideology of you have to make the world, I don't know, your own truth. Like, you got to find your own truth, man. Create your own truth. Well, that's, for me, that's kind of, I don't know. I'm just going to relay that's what he says. That's what I took away from it. So, and then I think Dawn of Day, this is always kind of his next major work. This is going to flush things out more clearly. I know in this book, he's really, really going to come after morality. The concept of good and evil is going to get hammered in this. Now, I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to be beginning this, and I think his philosophy is a little bit more flushed out here. This is kind of a transitory work that I just read, and then this is like the dawn of day, because this is like his philosophy awakening, right, to the dawn. So we'll have this, and then the joyful science, and then I have Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And if I get through that and I want to continue on, then maybe I'll read Twilight of the Gods and some of his other stuff. But I do think that Nietzsche is interesting, and I do think that he's kind of laid the seeds of the 20th century and beyond. I think that this nihilistic, he worries about nihilism. He lays the foundation for nihilism, but I don't think he wants people to be nihilistic. Unfortunately, I think that in my opinion, my view, if you tear down all these government, church, all this stuff, marriage, the foundation of the family unit and everything, then what are you left with? You know, man, the wanderer, wandering alone. I guess this is the foundation for the Ubermensch, the Superman. I need no one. But we'll see. We'll see how this develops as it moves on, and hopefully this wasn't extremely boring. It probably was, but I wanted to get my thoughts and my summaries out on this so that I could get it down while it's still fresh in my mind, so this doesn't just all go whoop, so that I have a record of it, my thoughts and feelings of it here, recorded for myself in the future if I ever want to come back and see what I had to say about this. And maybe I'm completely wrong on a lot of this stuff. Maybe if I was to go back and reread this, having read some more of Nietzsche, I'd understand this work a little bit more and be able to offer maybe a more concise critique. But this is my first Nietzsche I've ever read, and so hopefully I think I grabbed a lot of what he was putting down. There's a lot there. Hopefully I'm not like 100 miles off base, and I kind of got the gist of it. I don't know. If there's any Nietzsche scholars out there, let me know. What did I get wrong? But anyways, for the 3 people that are probably watching this, thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.